Hello, traveler. You did not find this video by accident. If you are here in this very moment, then perhaps your unconscious or something deeper still has quietly prepared you for a shift. Not through effort, not through willpower, but through a very natural rearrangement of reality itself, arriving precisely when you have begun to grow exhausted from trying to control everything. Carl Jung once whispered something quite strange, that what we quietly avoid in the darkness rarely disappears. It merely waits for a moment, quiet enough to be heard. He did not try to eliminate the shadow, but learned to listen to it as a dark mirror reflecting the ego. Tonight, we step into that journey, not to fix ourselves, but to allow a natural rebirth to unfold. The moment before sleep is a narrow gate, a living bridge where consciousness begins to soften and the unconscious opens its door. In the next hour, you are not a mother, not a wife, not a memory. You are a soul returning home. Here there is no need to try, no need to understand. Change, if it comes, will come like breath, without effort, without force. Hello, I am Milo, and tonight I am here to walk beside you, not to teach you or repair you, but simply to be with you, as a long day finally comes to a close. If you feel understood, you may leave a short sentence in the comments, not for anyone else, but as a sealing mark sent down into the unconscious. I allow this transition to unfold. And now, begin to breathe deep, slow, even. Release all agitation, all tension, and allow the unconscious to arrange itself naturally. Perhaps in this stillness, you drift into sleep that is completely okay. Very okay. Because you are enough. And you have always been enough. Next, we begin at the place where the mask becomes too heavy. A moment not many dare to face. 1. The call at 3 a.m. when the burden of the persona becomes too heavy. Yes, there is a familiar moment that many women dare to face only when the clock strikes 3 in the morning. There is no longer the noise of the world, no evaluating gazes, no roles left to maintain. All that remains is an exhausted body lying in the darkness, and a mind that refuses to sleep. That feeling is not quite sadness, nor exactly pain, but a quiet depletion, as if the soul has been holding itself together for far too long and has finally run out of strength to keep pretending. Carl Gustav Jung called the mask we wear each day the persona, the mask or role that a person presents to the world. And it is precisely this seemingly necessary mask that, when identified with for too long as the true self, becomes an invisible burden that crushes inner life from within. For many years, countless women have learned how to be fine. Fine, so the family will not worry. Fine, so society is not inconvenienced. Fine, so they are not seen as weak, troublesome, or too emotional. They step into the too tight shoes of social expectation, trying to walk gracefully within them until the feet of the soul are bleeding and still they smile. Jung warned that the persona, when worn as a flexible garment, helps us adapt to the world. But when we believe that we are that mask, tragedy begins. He wrote, "The persona is that which, in reality, one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is." Collected Works, Volume 7. 3 a.m. is precisely the hour when the persona begins to crack. Not because it is weak, but because it has been overworked. When there is no one left to perform for, when there are no roles left to fulfill the true human being imprisoned behind the mask begins to speak. But that voice is not loud. It does not scream. It appears as a nameless emptiness, a vague sadness, a sense that something is wrong, but I don't know what. Many people are frightened by this moment. They turn on the lights, reach for their phones, try to fill the void. But Jung would tell us, this is not a sign of collapse. It is a sign of truth. In depth psychology, a crisis is not the moment when something breaks, but the moment when an old structure can no longer contain the life that is growing within it. Jung once wrote a sentence that both terrifies and consoles. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. Seen through a Jungian lens, insomnia at 3 a.m. is not an enemy to be defeated, but a call. That call says you have lived too long for the outer image and forgotten the inner life. You have become adapted, but not necessarily authentic. And the soul which does not consent to being ignored forever chooses the night to speak, because during the day, the ego is far too busy to listen. What matters here is not trying to fix the feeling of emptiness, but changing how we understand it. Jung never advised people to flee from inner darkness. On the contrary, he believed that it is precisely in the moments when the persona collapses that the seed of individuation finally has the chance to sprout. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Collected Works, Volume 13. When the persona cracks, we are given our first real opportunity to ask, if I am not who society expects me to be, then who am I? That question is frightening, but it is also profoundly liberating, because it opens the possibility of living a life that is not merely correct, but alive, not merely accepted, but authentic. Jung emphasized that the soul does not require perfection. It requires honesty. The repressed emotions, the desires, never acknowledged the exhaustion, never permitted to show all of these, are waiting to be seen, not to dominate you, but to be integrated. So do not fear the call at 3 a.m. Do not rush to label it as weakness, depression, or failure. See it instead as a sacred moment when the persona sets its burden down, if only for a while, so the soul may breathe. In that quiet darkness, you do not need to be fine. You only need to be real. And it is precisely from that fragile truth that a deep transformation, slow but enduring, can begin. Jung believed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And sometimes that journey does not begin with radiant light, but with a sleepless night at 3 a.m. 2. The dark mirror, confronting the rejected brother. When the persona has cracked in the silence of 3 a.m., when the role of the woman who is fine is finally set down, an inner emptiness opens up. That moment can feel disorienting, as if you have stepped out of a familiar room into a dark corridor you have never walked before. But Jung would say this: it is precisely in the stillness that follows the collapse of the persona that the ego, for the first time, has the opportunity to see what it has avoided its entire life. With no mask left to shield it, with no social justifications remaining, the ego is forced to turn and face what lies behind it. And there it encounters the shadow, like a rejected brother, standing silently in the mirror, waiting for a very long time. The shadow does not arrive with loud noise. It does not crash in like a storm. It appears as an uncomfortable reflection, the emotions you learned to suppress, the thoughts you were once ashamed to have, the desires that were labeled selfish, bad, or improper. Jung did not define the shadow as evil, but as the part of the personality that has not been lived. He wrote a famous line that is often misunderstood: everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Psychology and Religion Collected Works, Volume 11. This statement is not meant as a threat, but as a warning. Jung was not saying that the shadow is dangerous because it is bad. He was saying that the shadow becomes dangerous when it is not made conscious. What is pushed into the unconscious does not disappear. It merely changes location. And from that hidden place, it begins to influence our lives in ways we cannot control, through unexplained anger, persistent envy, exaggerated reactions, or a sense of self-loathing without knowing why. To confront the shadow, therefore, is not an act of rebellion, but an act of honesty. And yet, this is the step the ego fears the most. For the ego is built to maintain a consistent image of who I am, while the shadow whispers, "You are more than that." Jung frankly called this a profound moral problem, not in the sense of social morality, but in the sense of facing inner truth. He wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort." Ion Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 2. Moral effort. Here does not mean trying to become better, but daring to look directly at what one does not want to see. It may be anger suppressed for many years. It may be the longing to choose for oneself instead of always sacrificing. It may be resentment forbidden because I shouldn't think that way. The shadow contains all these fragments, not to condemn you, but to say, I belong to you as well. One of the greatest misunderstandings about the shadow is the belief that it contains only negative qualities. Jung strongly opposed this view. He pointed out that the shadow also stores vital life forces that were stripped away during social adaptation. Decisiveness, the instinct to protect oneself, the capacity to say no, and even raw creative energy. When a child learns that love is granted only when they are obedient, their natural rebelliousness is pushed into the shadow. When a woman learns that self-sacrifice is the highest virtue, the part of her that knows how to set boundaries is labeled selfish and buried. But the shadow does not forget. It remembers everything. This is why Jung emphasized that the shadow is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a brother to be reconciled with. This process does not require judgment. It requires presence. Not, I shouldn't have this feeling, but what is this feeling trying to tell me? Jung believed that only when the ego is humble enough to listen to the shadow does the process of individuation truly begin. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Alchemical Studies, Collected, Works, Volume 13. To look into the dark mirror is not to torment oneself, but to reclaim the lost parts of who one is. When you allow the shadow to be present without rushing to fix or eliminate it, a quiet transformation takes place. Energy that was once suppressed is released, and inner conflicts gradually lose their destructive force. Jung never promised that this journey would be easy, but he believed it is the only path toward wholeness. For a person who lives only in the light is always fragile, but a person who dares to embrace the darkness as well develops deep and enduring roots. And so, when the late night invites you to stand before that dark mirror, do not turn away too quickly. Do not name it weakness or failure. See it instead as a sacred moment in which the soul asks to be reunited with itself. The shadow does not come to destroy the ego, but to expand it. Not to pull you down, but to remind you that you are deeper, wider, and more real than what you were ever allowed to become. And it is within that silent reconciliation that the journey back to the true self finally begins. 3. Projection. The guests on the walls of the mind. When the ego has gathered enough courage to stand before the dark mirror of the shadow and recognize that the rejected part is not an enemy, but a lost brother, a deeper question immediately arises. If the shadow does not disappear, then where has it been during all the years we turned our backs on it? Jung answered this question with one of the most important concepts in depth psychology: projection. For the shadow rarely remains still within the inner darkness. When it is not acknowledged, it seeks a way into the outer world, puts on the face of other people, and appears as uncomfortable guests on the walls of our mind. It is precisely here that human beings begin to fight with themselves without realizing it. Perhaps you have experienced this someone completely unfamiliar who has never harmed you. Yet a single gesture, a tone of voice, or a glance from them is enough to irritate you beyond all explanation. Or you may notice that you are particularly harsh toward the faults of others, condemning them with a severity far beyond what the situation requires. Jung did not consider these reactions accidental. He saw them as traces of projection, the mechanism the unconscious uses to cast the unaccepted contents of the shadow outward. he wrote a well-known line: "Projections turn the world into the replica of one's own unknown face." Archetypes and the collective unconscious. Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. In this case, the world is no longer perceived as it truly is, but becomes a distorted mirror, reflecting what we have not yet had the courage to acknowledge within ourselves. When the ego cannot tolerate the existence of a certain trait, weakness, anger, selfishness, or even repressed talent and longing, it throws that trait onto others. And instead of facing an inner conflict, we enter an outer battle, believing the problem lies with them, not with me. The most painful aspect of projection is that it convinces us we are reacting to reality, when in fact we are reacting to an unconscious part of ourselves. Jung identified this as one of the greatest sources of misunderstanding, conflict, and suffering in human relationships. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The undiscovered self collected. Works, Volume 10. This statement does not carry the simple moral meaning of do not judge others. It points to something far deeper. Every exaggerated emotional reaction is a psychological clue. When you are excessively triggered, when your emotions exceed the concrete situation, it is no longer a matter of the present. It is the echo of the past and of a shadow that has not yet been integrated. Projection, therefore, is not a mistake, but a signpost indicating where within you something is asking to be seen again. Jung emphasized that projection is not only negative. We do not project only what we despise. We also project what we blindly admire. When you place someone on a pedestal, seeing them as the embodiment of everything good, it is very likely that you are perceiving your own unlived potentials. Both directions, rejection and idealization, point to the same truth: you have not yet reclaimed ownership of those parts within yourself. Projection, according to Jung, is the price one pays for not yet being ready to become whole. The problem is that projection offers a false relief. When we believe the fault lies with others, the ego is temporarily protected. But the cost is the loss of inner freedom. For when the shadow lives outside of us, we become victims of the world, constantly triggered, wounded, and disappointed. Jung wrote that the most important step in psychological maturation is the withdrawal of projection, a painful yet liberating process. He said, "As long as you are unconscious of yourself, you will project your own darkness onto others." Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 2. To withdraw. Projection does not mean blaming yourself for everything that happens. It means shifting the question from why are they like that to which part of me is being touched. When you do this, the outer world begins to lose its absolute power over your emotional life. Others are no longer enemies or idols, but mirrors, helping you identify the fragments that are waiting to be integrated. This is the subtle intersection between shadow and projection. The shadow is the rejected content. Projection is the way the shadow finds expression. When you dare to return to the dark mirror in Part 2, and then recognize the uncomfortable guests on the walls of the mind in Part 3, you are walking the path Jung called individuation. This path does not make you perfect. It makes you responsible for your inner world. Jung believed that only when human beings stop fighting the phantoms outside themselves can they begin a genuine relationship, both with others and with themselves. And so, the next time you feel irrationally triggered, pause for a moment. Instead of turning away, ask, what has this guest come to teach me? For it may be that what you most strongly dislike in another is a part of yourself longing to be seen, to be understood, and finally, to come home. 4. Gold in the darkness, the treasure hidden in the basement. When the guests on the walls of the mind are gradually recognized, when we stop blaming the outer world and begin to withdraw the projections we have cast outward, another kind of silence emerges, no longer threatening, like the moment the persona collapsed, nor as sharp as when the shadow was reflected through others. It is the silence of a basement that has just been unlocked. And within the darkness of that space, Jung invites us to do something even more daring, not only to see the shadow, but to search for the treasure buried within it. For the shadow, contrary to common belief, is not merely a repository for what is bad. It is also the refuge of raw vitality that we were once forced to abandon in order to be loved, accepted, and safe. Jung emphasized that the shadow contains everything that the ego and society do not permit to enter the light. This includes anger, selfishness, and desire. But it also includes courage, creativity, the instinct for self-protection, and a fierce joy in being alive. He wrote, "The shadow is not necessarily always an opponent. In fact, the shadow is exactly like the ego, if the ego were to become aware of it." Collected Works, Volume 14. In other words, the shadow is not the worst part of you. It is the part that has not been lived. When a child learns that love is granted only when they are obedient, the stubbornness which carries powerful personal energy is pushed into the shadow. When a woman learns that gentleness is the highest virtue, the decisive part of her is labeled difficult. When a boy learns that crying is weakness, his sensitivity is buried. These parts do not die. They are merely locked away in the psychological basement, waiting to be found. For this reason, Jung warned that striving only to be good by social moral standards is a dangerous path. It creates people who are morally polished on the surface, but hollow within. He wrote a sentence that is controversial, yet profound. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Collected Works, Volume 7. Becoming nice in order to be loved may help us survive. But the price is often the loss of the courage to live truthfully. Many adults carry an unnamed exhaustion, not because they are weak, but because they have lived too long through only the parts that were permitted to exist, while their strongest parts remained locked away. The shadow thus becomes the place where gold is stored. Not moral gold, but life energy itself. Jung, deeply influenced by alchemy, often used the imagery of base metals and gold to describe this process. He wrote, "In the unconscious are hidden the roots of creative activity." Collected Works, Volume 8. Gold in the darkness does not reveal itself automatically. It emerges only when the ego has matured enough to take responsibility for its own power. For power that is not integrated becomes destructive, but power that is recognized and contained becomes the foundation of freedom. This is why Jung did not advocate the blind liberation of instinct. He did not call for living according to the shadow, but for entering into dialogue with it. Integrating the shadow does not mean acting out every impulse, but reclaiming abandoned energy so it can serve a conscious life. The crucial point here is this: only an ego that is sufficiently stable can carry the gold out of the basement without being burned by it. Jung stated clearly, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Collected Works, Volume 13. When darkness is made conscious, it is no longer darkness. It becomes a resource. Anger that was once forbidden becomes the capacity to set boundaries. Selfishness that was once condemned becomes the ability to care for oneself. Desire that was once buried becomes a direction for life. The shadow, when integrated, does not make a person more dangerous, but less so because they no longer need to act unconsciously to compensate for what was lost. This is the crucial transition from part 3 to part 4, when projection is withdrawn. Energy no longer leaks outward. When the shadow is acknowledged, that energy begins to return to the center. And it is precisely here that the treasure is found. Jung described this stage as the moment when the individual begins to become whole, not merely good in the social sense. He emphasized, the goal of individuation is not perfection, but wholeness. Collected Works, Volume 7. Wholeness means light and darkness, softness and firmness, fear and courage. A whole person does not need to prove that they are good, because they are already in a truthful relationship with themselves. And from that relationship, a deeper form of peace emerges. Not the peace of avoiding conflict, but the peace of no longer being inwardly divided. So when you descend into the basement of the shadow, do not search only for what needs to be fixed. Search for what needs to be redeemed. For what you call darkness may be the very place where you have hidden your true life force for a very long time. And when you bring that gold back into the light, not to display it, but to live, you will deeply understand what Jung meant when he affirmed that the journey of becoming oneself is not a journey of adding more, but a journey of reclaiming what has been lost. Wu. The mother complex and the burden of invisible labor. When the gold in the darkness has been discovered, when the life energies once buried begin to return to consciousness, a deeper question emerges. Why were these strengths taken away in the first place? For many women, Jung suggested that the answer lies not only in the individual, but within an ancient and persistent psychological structure, the mother complex. This is not a story about a particular mother, but about an emotional pattern formed from early needs for attachment, recognition, and love needs that, when insufficiently met, continue to shape adult life in quiet yet profound ways. Jung described a complex as an emotional nucleus with a life of its own within the psyche, operating almost autonomously. He wrote, "Complexes are autonomous, and therefore they can have us as much as we have them." Collected Works, Volume 8. In this case, the mother complex often manifests as an invisible emotional prison. A woman feels she has value only when she cares, when she sacrifices, when she carries the weight. Recognition does not come from being herself, but from meeting the needs of others. And so she learns to become the empath, the peacekeeper, the one who is always there, sometimes at the cost of both body and soul. The irony is this: the very qualities society praises often conceal a deep hunger that has never been named. Jung pointed out that the mother complex is not purely negative. On its bright side, it grants the capacity for nurturing empathy and bonding. But when it operates unconsciously, it turns care into obligation, love into a condition, and the self into an instrument. A woman may sacrifice herself to exhaustion in exchange for a nod, a word of approval, or simply to avoid being abandoned. Jung warned that when a complex functions in the dark, it takes control of behavior. He wrote, "When a complex is constellated, the whole psyche is oriented in accordance with it." Collected Works, Volume 8. Here, invisible labor is not only housework or emotional caretaking for others. It is psychological labor, constant listening, adjusting, soothing, enduring. Many women grow up with an unspoken belief: if I don't carry the load, everything will fall apart. This belief rarely comes from conscious choice. It arises from early emotional memory, from a time when safety seemed to depend on being compliant, on taking care of others. The mother complex, therefore, is not merely the past. It lives in the present, governing relationships, careers, and the way a woman treats herself. The crucial point Jung emphasized is this: unconscious sacrifice is not love. When sacrifice becomes a compulsion, it is no longer a free act, and anything that does not arise from inner freedom leads inevitably to resentment, emptiness, and exhaustion. Jung wrote a sentence that seems simple, yet carries immense weight. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. Collected Works, Volume 13. Placed within the context of the mother complex. This statement reveals a painful truth. Many women are not living their own lives, but carrying forward the unlived desires of previous generations. They carry an invisible mandate to be right, to sacrifice, to endure. But the psyche cannot grow by giving alone. At some point, often after many years of carrying the load, the soul rebels through exhaustion, depression, or a loss of direction. This is where Jung's deeply motivating message appears. Self-love is not selfishness, but an act of inner ethics. Withdrawing energy from the mother complex does not mean becoming cold or irresponsible. It means redefining the boundary between care and self-destruction. Jung believed that an individual matures only when they dare to confront their complexes instead of remaining governed by them. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Collected Works, Volume 10. When the mother complex is brought into consciousness, a subtle shift occurs. A woman begins to ask, "What do I need without guilt?" This question, seemingly simple, is a revolutionary act in a life long shaped by sacrifice. And it is precisely here that the gold in the darkness from Part 4 finds its dwelling place, the power to set boundaries, the right to rest, the right to exist without conditions. Jung emphasized that the goal of individuation is not to become a better mother, a better caregiver, or a more skilled sacrificer, but to become a whole human being. He affirmed, the goal of individuation is not perfection, but wholeness. Collected Works, Volume 7. Wholeness means the ability to love without losing oneself, the ability to give without erasing oneself from the equation. When the mother complex is released from the shadows, a woman no longer has to prove her worth through exhaustion. Self-love then ceases to be a slogan and becomes a sacred act of resistance. Resistance against unconscious patterns that once whispered, "You are worthy only when you sacrifice." And so, the journey from shadow to projection to gold in the darkness to the mother complex is not a journey of adding new roles, but a journey of removing old chains. When a woman allows herself to exist unconditionally, the psyche begins to breathe. And within that breath, Jung believed a different life, more truthful, more profound, can finally begin. 6. The Night Sea Journey. Dissolution as the path to rebirth. When the mother complex is gradually brought into consciousness, when a woman begins to withdraw energy from unconscious sacrifice and allows herself to exist without conditions, a very particular state emerges within the psyche. There is no longer a compulsion to prove oneself, yet there is also no clear sense of who one is becoming. It is a fragile in-between space where old structures have lost their authority, but new forms have not yet taken shape. Jung called this a necessary phase of transformation, and in his deepest symbolic language, he named it the Night Sea Journey. This is not a poetic metaphor, but a psychological reality that anyone who travels far along the path of individuation must eventually pass through. In the Night Sea Journey, the ego no longer holds the role of commander. After bearing the weight for too long, with the persona, with the shadow, with projection, with the complexes, the ego is forced to relinquish control. And the moment of letting go rarely feels like victory. It feels like dissolution. Jung described this as the moment when a person is pulled away from the safe shore of consciousness and drawn down into the depths of the collective unconscious, much like the ancient image of the hero being swallowed by the belly of the whale. He wrote, "The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego." Collected Works, Volume 14. The defeat of the ego, in this context, is not something negative. It is a necessary condition for psychological rebirth. Jung emphasized that only when the ego stops trying to control the process of life does the psyche gain the space to reorganize itself. This is the stage alchemy calls nigredo, the blackening, where old forms disintegrate, all certainties are blurred, and one is forced to remain in darkness without ready-made answers. Jung wrote a crucial line about this state. In all chaos, there is a cosmos in all disorder, a secret order. Collected Works, Volume 8. Sleep through a Jungian lens is not merely biological rest. It is a ritual gateway that leads human beings into the night sea journey each night. As you fall asleep, the ego recedes, personal boundaries dissolve, and the collective unconscious, the realm that holds humanity's memory, images, and wisdom, begins to speak through dreams, symbols, and vague sensations. This is why many people feel fear. When insomnia arises during this phase, they fear the sensation of no longer being myself. But Jung would say, this is not the loss of the self, but the loss of the old shell. The night sea journey is often accompanied by a sense of heaviness, fatigue, or even emptiness. Old motivations no longer function. Yet no new direction is visible. Jung saw this as a sign that the psyche is working at a deep level beyond the reach of conscious will. He warned that trying to escape quickly from this phase through action control or rationalization only prolongs suffering. He wrote, "One cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning." Collected Works, Volume 7. This sentence is especially significant when placed in the context of the night sea journey. The strategies that once helped us survive, be loved, and be recognized, especially for women who have carried too much for too long, no longer apply in the second half of psychic life. Nigredo arrives not to punish, but to strip away forms that have exhausted their life force. In that darkness, one is invited to dissolve into water, to release rigid identities, and merge into a larger current of nature and psyche. Jung emphasized that the night sea journey cannot be shortened by willpower. It is an inevitable inner right. He wrote, "Transformation does not come from outside. It comes from within." Collected Works, Volume 12. In Alchemy. Nigredo is always the first and most painful stage because it destroys the illusion of stability. But Jung pointed out that without Nigredo, there can be no albedo or rubedo, no rebirth without dissolution. Likewise, deep sleep, in which the ego temporarily disappears, is the safest form nature offers for human beings to undergo the night sea journey without being destroyed. Each night, if permitted, the psyche renews itself in the dark. The deeply motivating truth here is this: you don't need to do anything to deserve rebirth. The night sea journey does not demand effort. It demands permission. Permission not to know. Permission to be weak. Permission not to control. Jung believed that it is precisely in this surrender that a new order begins to form. He wrote, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life." Collected Works, Volume 12. When you enter sleep with this attitude, sleep is no longer an escape, but becomes a sacred right. You are not swallowed by darkness, you are carried by it. And in the belly of the whale of the collective unconscious, where there is no social identity, no roles, no obligations, the psyche begins to weave a new form of the self. Jung did not promise that you would awaken with clear answers, but he was certain that you would awaken different, softer, more truthful, and closer to your own center. So tonight, as you surrender to sleep, remember that you are not disappearing. You are participating in an ancient process that humanity has undergone since the beginning of time. The night sea journey is not an ending, but the necessary stillness before a new form of life emerges. And it is within that quiet darkness that Jung believed the seeds of the deepest rebirth are being silently prepared. 7. The language of symbols. Late night letters. When the night sea journey has completed its silent work, when the ego has dissolved deeply enough in Nigredo to relinquish its need for control and fixed identity, the psyche does not leave the human being in mute darkness for long. From that very silence, another form of communication begins to emerge. Not through reasoning, not through commands, but through symbols. Jung believed this is the moment when the unconscious begins to write its late-night letters, sending them to consciousness through the only channel it truly knows: dreams. He stated unequivocally, "The unconscious does not speak in words, but in images." Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. After the night. Sea journey. Daytime consciousness becomes softer, less defended. It is precisely then that images appearing in dreams, a snake sliding across the floor, an unfamiliar house with many rooms, never entered a faceless figure standing motionless in a hallway, do not arise to frighten or confuse, but to compensate for the one-sided attitude of waking life. Jung called this principle compensation. The unconscious constantly seeks to balance what consciousness has forgotten, denied, or exaggerated beyond measure. He wrote, "The dream is the small, hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul." Collected Works, Volume 10. To understand dreams according to Jung is not to consult a dream dictionary and assign fixed meanings to symbols. A snake is not always sexuality. A house is not always the self. Jung strongly opposed rigid decoding systems because they impoverish the living language of the psyche. He wrote, "No dream symbol can be separated from the individual who dreams it." Collected Works, Volume 8. A symbol does not carry a universal formulaic meaning. It carries a relational meaning between the image and the concrete life of the dreamer. What matters is not what the symbol is, but what the symbol does to you. What emotion does it evoke? How does it repeat? At what moment does it appear within your psychological process? Jung believed that it is here that the unconscious performs its guiding function, not by issuing commands, but by opening possibilities. Within the context of the night sea journey, when the ego has accepted not knowing symbols, become the bridge between the collective unconscious and personal life. Jung regarded symbols as the intermediary language between what cannot be said and what must be lived. He wrote, "A symbol does not define or explain. It points beyond itself to a meaning that is darkly divined, yet still beyond our grasp." Collected Works, Volume 6. These late-night letters often carry an unfamiliar tone, sometimes unsettling. But Jung emphasized that fear does not arise from the symbol itself, but from the ego's attitude toward the unknown. When the ego demands clarity, logic, and control, it cannot tolerate the ambiguous language of symbols. But when the ego has been softened through nigredo, it begins to listen without insisting on immediate explanation. And it is precisely then that symbols begin to do their healing work. Jung believed that dreams are not meant to predict the future, but to correct the present. They reveal where the psyche is out of balance, where energy is blocked, and where potential is waiting to be realized. He wrote, Dreams are impartial, spontaneous products of the unconscious psyche outside the control of the will. Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. This very impartiality makes dreams the most honest counselors, even when they are not pleasant. A dream of being lost may not say that you are inadequate, but that you have wandered too far from your own center. A dream of a collapsing house may not foretell disaster, but signal that an old psychological structure has completed its function. In Jungian language, a symbol does not conclude. It invites dialogue. The deeply motivating truth here is this: you do not need to understand a dream correctly for it to have effect. Jung emphasized that simply respecting the symbol is already a healing act. When you remember a dream, reflect upon it, or simply allow it to exist without rushing to dismiss it. You are building a new relationship with the unconscious. He wrote, "The psyche is a self-regulating system." Collected Works, Volume 8. This means that the psyche knows how to guide you toward wholeness as long as you do not interfere. These late-night letters do not arrive to confuse you, but to say that you are not alone in the process of transformation. There is a deeper intelligence at work within you, not logical intelligence, but symbolic intelligence, quietly shaping things from within. And so, after the night sea journey, when you awaken with vague dream images lingering from the night before, treat them with reverence. Do not rush to explain. Do not rush to forget. See them as letters written in dark ink sent from the deepest layers of the psyche to consciousness as it learns how to listen. Jung believed that the path back to oneself is not marked by clear signposts, but by symbols that appear at the right time, in the right place, within the right psychological state. He wrote, "The symbol is the best possible expression for something unknown." Collected Works, Volume 6. When you learn this language, sleep is no longer an unconscious void, but becomes a living dialogue between you and the ancient wisdom within you. And within those late-night letters, Jung believed the psyche is whispering its most essential truth. The path has always been within you. You only need to learn how to read it. 8. Synchronicity. Messages from the universe. When you begin to learn how to read the unconscious late-night letters through dreams and symbols, a subtle yet profound shift takes place in the way you perceive the world. It is not only inner images that become more vivid. External events themselves begin to seem as though they are whispering something to you. At this point, the psyche no longer communicates solely through images of the night, but also through meaningful coincidences of the day moments that cause you to pause, feel a shiver, and quietly ask, why now Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity, and he regarded it as the final bridge between the inner world and external reality. Synchronicity is neither magic nor superstition. Jung introduced this concept with great caution, knowing how deeply it challenges traditional causal thinking. He defined it precisely and famously. Synchronicity is a causal connecting principle. Collected Works, Volume 8. A causal without causality means that there is no cause and effect relationship according to ordinary logic, yet the events are connected by meaning. A dream about an old friend followed the next morning by an unexpected message from that very person. A silent inner question, and later that day, you happen to read a line in a book that answers it exactly. Jung did not claim that these events cause one another. He said they co-occur within the same field of meaning, reflecting a deeper order that reason cannot measure. After passing through the night sea journey and learning the language of symbols, the ego no longer clings so tightly to control. It is precisely this loosening that allows synchronicity to enter awareness. Jung believed that when consciousness becomes more flexible and humble, it begins to recognize connections that have always existed but were previously overlooked. He wrote, "Meaningful coincidences are unthinkable as long as one clings to the notion that causality explains everything." Collected Works, Volume 8. What matters here is not the number of coincidences, but the quality of the inner experience when they occur. Synchronicity is often accompanied by a distinctive feeling, a subtle vibration, a moment of stillness, as if time briefly pauses. It is the sensation of being seen by an order larger than oneself. Jung regarded this feeling as a sign that the psyche and the outer world have entered a state of resonance. It is not that you control life, nor that life controls you. The two are in dialogue. The deeply motivating aspect of synchronicity is that it breaks the sense of existential isolation. When a person travels far enough along the path of individuation, they are often required to leave behind old maps, familiar values, and even social certainties. This path can feel profoundly lonely. Jung understood this well, and synchronicity, in his view, appears as invisible markers along the journey, reminding the traveler that they have not been abandoned. He wrote, "At such moments, the individual feels caught up in a meaningful process in which he has no part as an ego." Collected Works, Volume 8. This does not mean that every coincidence carries a cosmic message, nor that one should search obsessively for meaning in everything. Jung warned that exaggerating synchronicity leads to superstition and the misuse of symbols. He emphasized that synchronicity is meaningful only when it touches a living psychological situation, when it directly relates to a genuine inner movement. Without that resonance, coincidence is merely coincidence. Thus, learning to work with synchronicity is not about blind belief, but about cultivating an attitude of listening. When a synchronous event occurs, the question is not, "What is the universe trying to say?" but rather, "Which part of me is being touched?" Jung consistently returned responsibility to the inner world. Synchronicity does not replace personal choice. It simply illuminates the context so that choice may become more conscious. At the deepest level, Jung viewed synchronicity as evidence that the individual psyche is not separate from the order of the world. The inner and the outer are not alien domains, but two aspects of the same living process. He wrote, "Psyche and matter are contained in one and the same world, and moreover, are in continuous contact with one another." Collected Works, Volume 8. This statement carries immense consolation. It suggests that what you experience in the depths of your soul is not isolated or meaningless. It belongs to a larger web of life. When you begin to trust this process, not through blind faith, but through attentive presence, quiet nods begin to appear. They do not command. They do not promise. They simply affirm, you are where you need to be, at the moment you need to be there. And so, after learning to read symbols in dreams, synchronicity invites you to learn how to read the symbols of life itself. An unexpected encounter, a passing remark, a book that falls into your hands at just the right moment. All of these can become signs if you are present enough to recognize them. Jung did not promise that this path would be easy, but he believed it would be meaningful. He wrote, "Life is not a series of meaningless accidents, but a meaningful whole." Collected Works, Volume 8. When you walk with this awareness, life no longer feels like a chain of disconnected events, but a journey woven from subtle connections between soul and world. Synchronicity does not say that everything will unfold according to your will. It says that everything is unfolding with you. And within that deep perception, Jung believed human beings discover a new kind of faith. Not faith in control, but faith in the quiet companionship of a greater order that silently supports the journey back to oneself. 9. Active imagination, a dialogue in gentle darkness. When a person begins to recognize the quiet nods of synchronicity in daily life, when they no longer feel entirely cast into a meaningless universe, but gradually sense a subtle companionship between the inner world and the outer. 1. A natural question arises. How can one enter into a more direct dialogue with the forces moving within oneself? Jung did not allow this question to remain vague. He developed a concrete method, both daring and deeply humane, and called it active imagination. If synchronicity is the way the psyche speaks to us through the outer world, then active imagination is how we respond by stepping directly into the inner space with conscious presence. Jung observed that chaotic thoughts, obsessive images, or inner voices do not arise to torment the human being, but to be heard when repressed or suppressed by reason. They become aggressive, disruptive, and sometimes take on a demonic quality. But when approached with an attitude of dialogue, they change entirely. Jung wrote, "Active imagination is a method of assimilating unconscious contents." Collected Works, Volume 8. Assimilating, integrating is the key word here. Active imagination does not aim to eliminate the shadow, nor to fix or purify it, but to bring it into relationship with the ego. Jung believed that the psyche functions like a community of small personalities, each carrying a story, a memory, an unlived emotion. When the ego is authoritarian, these personalities are pushed into the dark. When the ego collapses in nigredo, they surge up as chaos. But when the ego learns to sit down and listen, chaos begins to organize itself. Active imagination begins with something very simple and very difficult, staying with an inner image without fleeing, an angry face, a crying child, a strange creature. Instead of driving it away or analyzing it, immediately, Jung invited the individual to enter into dialogue. He wrote, "The essential thing is to differentiate oneself from these contents by personifying them, and at the same time to bring them into relationship with consciousness." Collected Works, Volume 7. This personification is not fanciful imagination, but a profound psychological act. When you invite a figure from the shadow to step onto the stage, you acknowledge that it has a voice, emotions, and a reason for existing. Jung placed particular emphasis on compassion in this process. The shadow often takes the form of a demon, not because it is evil, but because it has been abandoned for too long. And like an abandoned child, it learns to scream in order to be noticed. Jung observed that when an inner image is listened to with respect, it begins to transform on its own. Aggression softens. Demands turn into needs. And darkness begins to reveal its wisdom. He wrote, "When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate." Collected Works, Volume 10. Active imagination is the way to bring fate back into the space of inner dialogue. Instead of allowing the shadow to control behavior from behind the scenes, the person invites it onto the stage and asks, "What do you want? What do you need? Where were you abandoned?" This is not weakness. It is an act of courage, for it requires the ego to relinquish its exclusive authority and accept that it is not the sole center of the psyche. The deeply motivating power of active imagination lies in this. It restores human agency within the healing process without denying darkness. Jung did not advocate positive thinking or the repression of negativity. He believed that every attempt at exclusion leads to fragmentation. Instead, he wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries." Collected Works, Volume 11. Within the space of active imagination, inner demons, anger, envy, fear, desire, when acknowledged, gradually transform. They no longer need to destroy, because they are now allowed to participate in conscious life. Jung observed that many guiding symbols, images of wisdom, and even figures with a teacher quality emerge precisely from the shadow when a person is patient enough to listen. What was once considered dangerous becomes a guide. However, Jung also warned that active imagination is not a technique for entertainment or escape from reality. It requires an ego stable enough to return to outer life and take responsibility for what has been discovered. He wrote, "One must not turn away from reality, but must return to it again and again." Collected Works, Volume 7. This keeps active imagination a gentle dialogue rather than a dangerous immersion. The dialogue does not replace life. It deepens life. When a person learns to speak with the shadow instead of fighting it, a new form of intelligence emerges. Not the intelligence of control, but the intelligence of relationship. And so, after recognizing synchronicity as signs in the outer world, active imagination invites you to turn inward and continue the dialogue. There is no longer a need to search for signs everywhere. The signs are waiting within the gentle darkness of the psyche itself. Jung believed that when people treat their inner world with this kind of respect, They do not only heal individually, but also contribute to the healing of the collective. For every shadow that is integrated is a portion of the world's darkness brought into light. Ultimately, active imagination does not promise immediate peace, but it promises a truthful relationship with oneself. And within that relationship, Jung believed human beings no longer need to fear the darkness. For darkness, when listened to, is no longer the dwelling place of demons, but becomes the birthplace of wisdom, where the forgotten parts of the soul are finally named, embraced, and gently guided home. 10. Letting go of control. The power of non-doing Wu Wei. When the gentle dialogue of active imagination has unfolded long enough, when the figures of the shadow are no longer driven away, but truly listened to, a subtle inner shift begins to take place. The need for control starts to dissolve. The ego, long accustomed to directing planning and forcing outcomes, grows weary of its own role as commander. After sincere inner dialogues, the ego comes to realize that the tighter it grips, the more exhausted it becomes. The harder it tries to do things right, the more rigid life feels. It is precisely at this threshold that Jung opens onto a profound intuition. Power does not lie in forced action, but in the capacity to let go. He found this intuition resonating deeply with Eastern philosophy, and held particular admiration for the spirit of Wu Wei, non-forcing action that does not coerce the natural flow. Jung did not borrow Wu Wei as a comforting slogan, but as a deep psychological principle. He observed that much existential tension arises from the ego's desperate attempt to control outcomes, to control emotions, identity, and the future itself. But the psyche does not operate like a machine. It is a self-regulating system. Jung wrote, "The psyche is a self-regulating system." Collected Works, Volume 8. When the ego tries to dominate a self-regulating system, conflict is inevitable. Wu Wei in a Jungian context does not mean passivity or resignation. It means conscious trust in the psyche's inner intelligence. After active imagination, once the ego has learned how to listen, the next natural step is to stop interfering. There is no longer a need to command the darkness to disappear, nor to force the light to emerge. The river of the soul, when loosened, finds its own path. Jung warned that the ego's attachment to control not only exhausts the individual, but impoverishes the process of life itself. He wrote a statement that seems paradoxical, yet profound. The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. Collected Works, Volume 14. This defeat is not loss in the usual sense. It is the return of the ego to its proper place, a humble coordinator, not an authoritarian ruler. Wu Wei invites the ego to step back from the center so that a deeper order may emerge. In everyday life, this often appears as a subtle shift. The urgent impulse to do something immediately softens, replaced by an ability to remain present without panic. The deeply motivating aspect of Wu Wei is this: letting go is not losing. Jung emphasized that what truly belongs to the process of individuation will not be lost simply because you stop forcing it. He wrote, in essence, what is truly meant for us will not be lost. This idea appears repeatedly throughout Jung's writings on individuation, especially CW volumes 7 to 9. In this spirit, what falls away when you let go is often what has already lost its life force. Old roles, old expectations, attachments rooted in fear. Wu Wei does not promise that life will become easier. It promises that life will become rhythmic. And rhythm is the condition under which vitality returns. Jung also saw a strong connection between Wu Wei and the afternoon of life, the second half of the soul's journey. The strategies of life's morning striving, conquering ascending, no longer serve when the psyche turns toward integration. He wrote, "One cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning." Collected Works, Volume 7. Wu Wei. Therefore is not surrender, it is maturity. It says that you do not need to prove your worth through tension. After dialoguing with the shadow, retrieving projections, integrating the gold in the darkness, loosening the mother complex, passing through the night. See Journey. Learning the language of symbols, sensing synchronicity, and conversing inwardly through active imagination. The next step is not to do more, but to do less. Less control, less forcing, less insistence on immediate outcomes. Jung warned especially against the illusion that willpower can replace natural process. He wrote, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it." Collected Works, Volume 12. Acceptance. Here is not resignation. It is the gateway to transformation. Wu Wei is the action of dynamic acceptance. You remain present, you listen, you respond when needed, but you do not drag the river toward yourself. When you release control, you do not lose direction. You allow direction to emerge. In emotional life, Wu Wei manifests as the capacity to let sadness pass without labeling it to allow joy, without clinging to let uncertainty exist without panic. Jung believed that here, the self, the deepest coordinating center of the psyche, begins to operate more clearly. He wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious." Collected Works, Volume 12. When the ego relinquishes command, the self leads through subtle signals, a gentle impulse, a sense of right timing, a calm, without obvious reason. Wu Wei does not turn you into a passive being. It turns you into a collaborator with the process of life. You are not outside the current, you are within it. And so the invitation of Wu Wei at this stage is gentle yet decisive. Allow yourself to be carried, not by positive illusion, but by a deeper order that has repeatedly revealed its presence through dreams, through symbols, through synchronicities, through inner dialogue. Jung believed that when humans cease to force, life does not become meaningless. It becomes rhythmic. And within that rhythm, what truly belongs to you arrives at the right moment, neither sooner nor later. Ultimately, Wu Wei does not say, "Do nothing." It says, "Do not do the psyche's work for it. Let the river of the soul flow. What remains is essential. What departs is simply making room for a greater truth on its way." And in this letting go, Jung believed that human beings discover a new strength, the strength of deep trust in the process of becoming oneself. Shi Yi, the self, the mandala of eternal peace. When the effort to control has finally been laid down, when the ego no longer attempts to govern every outcome through rigid willpower, a very special stillness opens within the inner life. This is no longer the disorienting emptiness of nigredo, nor the instability of constant choice, but a felt sense of being held as if something deeper, wider, and quieter is silently keeping rhythm for every movement within you. It is precisely here that Jung says the human being begins to touch the self not as a philosophical idea, but as a lived experience. If Wu Wei is the moment the ego steps back, then the self is what reveals itself when that space becomes quiet enough to be filled by a greater order. Jung spoke of the self with great caution, knowing how easily it could be misunderstood as a higher ego or an idealized version of the personality. He stated unequivocally that the self is not the ego elevated, but the coordinating center of the entire psyche, embracing both consciousness and the unconscious. He wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. Collected Works, Volume 12. In other words, the self does not stand in opposition to darkness, conflict, or inner contradiction. It contains them all. After a person has passed through persona, shadow, and projection, after retrieving the gold in the darkness, after loosening the mother complex, after dissolving in the night sea journey, after learning to read symbols, after recognizing synchronicity, after dialoguing through active imagination, and after releasing control through Wu Wei, the self does not appear as a reward, but as a recognition that from the very beginning, a deeper order has always been present. Jung frequently symbolized the self through the mandala, the sacred circle found across cultures, religions, and within the dreams of his patients. The mandala is not a symbol of perfection, but of wholeness. He wrote, "The mandala is the psychological expression of the totality of the self." Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. What matters here is this: the mandala arises spontaneously within the psyche when a person is undergoing a profound inner reorganization. It is not drawn by will. It appears when the psyche has found its center. Jung observed that many people begin to dream of mandalas or feel a strong attraction to circular, symmetrical forms only after they have traveled far along the path of individuation. This reveals that the self is not the starting point, but the point of convergence. The experience of the self is usually quiet. It does not arrive as ecstatic bliss or a blinding moment of enlightenment, so often depicted in popular spirituality. Instead, it comes with a subtle peace, a feeling of being in the right place that requires no explanation. Jung described this as a fundamental shift in how a person relates to life. He wrote, "The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego." Collected Works, Volume 14. But this defeat is no longer painful. After Wu Wei, the ego has learned how to let go. And when the ego ceases to insist on being the center, the self begins its work, coordinating, balancing, guiding through subtle signals rather than commands. This is why Jung said that when the self becomes alive, a person can remain at peace, even amid storms. Not because the storm disappears, but because the center is no longer swept away. The most deeply motivating truth of the self is this: you do not need to eliminate conflict in order to find peace. The self does not deny suffering, loss, or uncertainty. It allows all of these to exist within a larger order. Jung wrote, The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life. Collected Works, Volume 12. This acceptance is not resignation to fate. It is a profound reconciliation with oneself. When a person lives closer to the self, life no longer has to be divided into rigid categories of right and wrong. Instead, life is seen as an unfolding process in which every experience, light or dark, has its place within the total mandala. Jung emphasized that the self carries a timeless dimension. It connects the individual to the collective unconscious, to the flow of humanity, and to archetypal patterns that existed long before the individual was born. He wrote, "The self is a quantity that is supraordinate to the conscious ego." Collected Works, Volume 7. For this reason, touching the self often brings a sense of no longer being alone in the universe, not in the sense that everything will support you, but in the deeper sense that you are part of a living order, greater than personal anxiety. This gives rise to a kind of trust very different from doctrinal religious faith or the ego's confidence. It is a trust born from direct inner experience. In everyday life, living closer to the self does not mean withdrawing from the world. On the contrary, Jung insisted that individuation always unfolds within real life, not outside it. The self does not pull you away from relationships, responsibilities, or choices. It allows you to enter them with less fragmentation. When the inner center is stable, the outer world no longer has to hold you together. And so, after Wu Wei, the self appears not as a summit to be conquered, but as a home remembered. You do not become the self. You recall it. Jung believed that the entire psychological journey is not meant to create a new person, but to help a person return to what has always been present. He wrote, "The goal of individuation is not perfection, but wholeness." Collected Works, Volume 7. The mandala of the self does not promise a tranquil life. It promises that you will no longer be torn apart by yourself. In the storm, you still sense the center. In loss, you still know you belong to the living stream. And in the deepest silence, Jung believed that human beings can touch a kind of peace that does not come from controlling the world, but from standing in the right place within the whole. This is the peace of the self, not the peace of escape, but the peace of wholeness. 12. Returning home. Individuation as awakening within sleep. When the mandala of the self has revealed itself as a quiet center amid all movement, when a person no longer seeks peace, by eliminating conflict, but by standing firmly within the whole. The Jungian journey does not conclude with a radiant climax, but with something profoundly human, the feeling of coming home. Not a return to a physical place, but a return to oneself, to the person who has always been there, yet obscured by roles, fears, and the relentless effort to be right. Jung called this point of convergence individuation, and he emphasized that it is not perfection, but wholeness. After all the dissolutions and integrations, the human being realizes that there is no need to become someone else. There is only the need to remember who one is. Jung often described individuation as a spiral path. There is no fixed destination, no finish line to cross, only cycles that grow deeper and increasingly true. He wrote a key sentence that became a cornerstone of depth psychology. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Collected Works, Volume 10. This statement is not a threat, but a liberation. It tells us that fate is not an external force, but unconscious life that has not yet been entered into dialogue. The entire journey from persona to shadow, from projection to the gold, in the darkness, from the mother complex to the night sea, journey from symbols to synchronicity, from active imagination to wu-wei, and from ego to the self, all moves toward a single aim, the reclamation of inner authorship, not through control, but through consciousness. What is striking about the stage of returning home is that it carries no sense of victory. There is no inner applause, no declaration of finished. Instead, it is marked by a deep simplicity. Jung wrote, "Individuation does not shut one out from the world, but gathers the world to oneself." Collected Works, Volume 7. Returning home does not mean withdrawing from life. It means entering life without fragmentation. A whole human being is not one without conflict, but one who is no longer torn apart by it. Light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, control and surrender, all find their place within a living mandala. Sleep, at this stage, takes on an entirely different meaning. It is no longer an escape from reality, nor merely the nigredo ritual of dissolution, but a space of integration. Jung saw sleep as the nightly moment when a person is allowed to return to their inner center, where the ego rests and the self continues its work. He wrote, "In sleep, consciousness is turned off but the psyche lives on. Collected Works, Volume 8. Therefore, the invitation at the end of this journey is not stay awake in order to do more, but sleep in order to remember. Remember the parts that have been named. Remember the parts that have been embraced. Remember that you are not a collection of roles, but a living, unfolding process. Awakening within sleep may sound paradoxical, but that paradox reflects Jung's deep intuition. Consciousness is not expanded only through daytime effort, but through nighttime reconciliation. Jung emphasized that the ultimate aim of individuation is not to become a good person by social moral standards, but to become a real one. He wrote, "The goal of individuation is not perfection, but wholeness." Collected Works, Volume 7. Wholeness means no longer having to eliminate any part of oneself in order to exist. When a person reaches this point, they no longer live for recognition, but from a stable inner center. This brings a form of peace that does not depend on circumstances, not because everything is fine, but because you are at home within yourself, regardless of how the outer world unfolds. The most deeply motivating truth of returning home is this: nothing on this journey is wasted. Every suffering, every detour, every collapse becomes material for wholeness. Jung believed there are no wrong experiences, only experiences not yet integrated. He wrote, "What we do not face in ourselves will appear in our lives as fate." Collected Works, Volume 10. When the unconscious is illuminated, fate loses its blind power. Life does not become predictable, but it becomes dialogical. A person is no longer dragged along by invisible forces, but walks with them with awareness and humility. And so the ending of this journey is not a promise about the future, but a reminder of the present. You are already here. The greater self you have been seeking is not waiting on some distant summit, but at the end of each spiral, where you are brave enough to turn back and see yourself with honest eyes. Jung did not promise that this path would bring happiness in the conventional sense, but he believed it brings meaning. And for Jung, meaning is the deepest foundation of a life worth living. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, do not sleep to forget who you once were. Sleep to remember who you are becoming, not through effort, but through permission. Allow the whole psyche to be present. Allow the mandala to keep turning. And in that quietness, Jung believed you may recognize the simplest and deepest truth of all. You were never away from home. You were only learning how to recognize it. Now the world has settled into the arms of the night. You no longer need to stand guard. You no longer need to hold any role in place. Allow the ship of your ego to drop its anchor and drift gently with the deep breathing rhythm of the unconscious sea. No masks, no effort to become someone. Only your pure presence slowly dissolving into the gentle light of your own being. If the whispers of tonight have touched you, you do not need to understand them all. Just let them remain like a soft hand resting on your heart, reminding you that you are safe. And if you wish to continue walking alongside gentle journeys like this, you may stay here by pressing subscribe or leaving a small sign in the comments below, so we may know that you are not walking alone in the night. And now, let your eyelids close naturally, wishing you a deep, luminous sleep and a sacred reunion with the eternal center, quietly waiting for you within.